Good afternoon. Very excited to join this esteemed panel of women to have a conversation about women, caregiving, and some of the really foundational things that are happening in this pandemic, post-pandemic environment. Please join me in welcoming Helen Ediosun, CEO and founder of Care Academy, Amy Goyer, caregiving expert from AARP, and Priya Krishnan, Senior Vice President of Client Relations and Sales Operations at Bright Horizon. So panelists, welcome. We've all heard so much about the Great Resignation and women quitting their jobs at higher rates than men during the pandemic and now as we wind down. We understand that we're at a pivotal moment of unprecedented dialogue around caregiving, around the burden of work in the home, about different work environments. And we just heard that the panel before us talking about that optionality and the need for flexibility moving forward. So I wanted to start off today's discussion to really think about caregiving and what you're seeing out in the community, the impact to caregivers based on what's been going on the last couple of years. Maybe Helen, you could kick us off.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. I think the technology that I'm really excited about, and I may be biased in terms of my approach in thinking about this, but it's the technology that has emerged in this pandemic, and as we get to the endemic stage, right, that builds on capacity of caregivers, of women. We saw a 30-year high. We basically reverted back in terms of the attrition of women from the workforce. And I think we have to be as emboldened about opportunities to empower women to return, right? Whether that is providing them with access to affordable childcare and caregiving overall for the entire continuum, whether that is also just educational resources in terms of how to care. And so what I'm really excited about is any resource that provides women access to flexibility and the capacity building to re-enter the workforce.
Really exciting stuff, Helen. Amy, your thoughts on that, maybe Priya.
Amy, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I thought I was told I would be automatically unmuted, sorry. What I was trying to say was that at AARP, we're focusing on family caregivers. And we fielded our last survey right before the pandemic in 2020. And at that point, we knew that 6 out of 10 family caregivers are working, 61% are women. And we also know that then during the pandemic, many more women were thrust into caregiving roles who were not already in that space. Many left the workplace in order to care for loved ones at home and keep them safe. We know that they were trying for more work flexibility, and we think this is perhaps one of the good things that will come out of the pandemic is that these flexible work options are making a huge difference for family caregivers. It makes it much easier for them to take care of loved ones who are living with them or who live nearby, or to have that time to make that call to the doctors or run to a doctor appointment with a loved one. So we're starting to see that the stress and the additional, caregiving is extremely stressful, but you added the pandemic on it. You had people who were isolated and could not see their loved ones, or they were with them 24/7. It was kind of, the two ends of the range because they didn't want anyone coming in the home to help care for them. They wanted to keep them safe. So I think that overall, the changes that we're seeing as a result of the pandemic, many more caregivers are now going to be online. We saw that about 6 in 10 caregivers had gone online to help with caregiving before the pandemic. I think those numbers are probably going to go up.
Yeah.
So from our perspective, I'll just add a little bit. I agree with everything both Helen and Amy said, but I would add potentially the positive that came out of this was the recognition of the fact that, caregiving and the conversation around caregiving got normalized because all of our lives are on screens and people can actually see what's going on, children walking into the room, a cat sitting through a meeting. And so while there is the exhaustion is real, the fact that the nature of care changed. So it wasn't just the fact that it was traditional caregiving, you were working from home, children were at home, schools had shut down, they were going into hybrid, going back into normal. So it was also the consistent change around the caregiving needs, and then worrying about elderly who you can see in a non-vaccinated world, etc. But that was one element of the stress. Work had changed, which was the second element of the stress. And then the third was, when was this going to end? There was no line of sight, and hence the exhaustion was high. The good in all of this is, whether it's employers or women, employees in general, I think the conversation is incredibly normalized and people are paying more attention to this than historically have ever done. So I see that as the positive that came out of the pandemic.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I realized I failed to introduce myself. So for those of you watching, my name is Susan Garfield. I'm EY's Chief Public Health Officer and co-director of our Center for Health Equity. And one of the other things I noticed, and it has dimensions from all of the different things that you said, was caregiving wasn't only something that happened in the home over the last couple of years, that in workplaces, people needed different types of engagement with their colleagues, with their bosses, with their employees, as the environment was so unusual and stressful. And I think that we're taking that concept of caregiving to be more universally applied in different settings where we find ourselves, which I think is also another positive thing that's coming out of the pandemic. So one of the things that I find really interesting, and Helen, you touched on this, is technology's role in supporting caregiving. And we talked about caregiving being more online than it ever has been. I was wondering if you saw other technological advancements or supports for either caregivers or the way care is being delivered. Amy, maybe you could start us off, and then Priya, and then Helen.
Right. Well, right prior to the pandemic, again, when we did our latest survey, 6 in 10 caregivers had gone online. The most common thing was to find services for their loved one. About 30% had done that. Getting prescriptions filled, ordering groceries, getting videos and training on how to be a caregiver, those tasks, shared calendars, ride services. But one of the key areas was connecting with other caregivers. And caregiving is extremely isolating because we tend to, you focus on who you're caring for and then your job, and then there's not room for much else. And we find that caregivers do much better when they're connecting with other caregivers. We started a Facebook group for family caregivers just about 6 months before the pandemic, and it just grew in leaps and bounds. We have over 8,500 members now, and I moderate the group. And what I'm seeing, it's like gives me a real insight into how important it is for those caregivers to be connected. They're not going to in-person support groups, although some of them have started up again. So I think that was one of the more growth areas during the pandemic, this connecting for personal support, problem solving, venting, getting that help from another caregiver that nobody else can provide. The other thing is the monitoring technology. We see a lot more coming into the marketplace, video programs, comprehensive systems where you have a video, you have, verbal, auditory, microphone connections, you have motion sensors, automatic fall detectors that are powered by radar so that they don't have to wear a device around their neck or on their wrist. So we see a lot more options with that. And during the pandemic, I think many caregivers put those in place because they weren't able to go see their mom and dad every day. The vast majority of caregivers care for people at home. So these kinds of technologies are really helpful in a home setting. I think those are going to continue, again, to be used more and more. The other piece was the socialization. So we have had our loved ones we're caring for who were increasingly isolated, and older adults tend to be isolated anyway, and then the pandemic on top of it. So people got very creative, and more older adults in particular were motivated to learn how to use video chat in some way, or how to use a smart speaker to call someone, or be in touch more, especially with the visual context. So I think those are some of the big growth areas we've seen lately, in addition to care coordination, which is one of the things people say they have the hardest time with. Setting up, just time savers like ordering groceries and that type of thing. And healthcare. Obviously, telehealth took off like crazy during the pandemic, and we AARP created a whole section on our website just to help people understand how to do telehealth, and people became much more proficient at it. So we see that again is going to be another silver lining with the pandemic going forward, that even the doctors, the healthcare systems saw the benefits for it. And for people like my parents who are homebound, it would have made things so much easier.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, such great points. And the detail you provide talks to the kind of different layers that technology is having in supporting both caregivers, changes in care paradigms, and new healthcare delivery systems. You mentioned telehealth and other monitoring technologies. So it really is multifaceted. Priya, Helen, and anything to add on to that?
I mean, I would have, I found it fascinating as Amy was talking, with the elements that the community aspects definitely something that's come through, even though it was an incredibly isolating time. I think there's almost shared solidarity, and this notion of it is a shared experience, even though we're individual and, in our caregiving responsibilities. So technology definitely played a role there. And whether it was you're the primary caregiver, or you were receiving it, or were looking for it. The second aspect, as again, as both as a provider of care, one of the areas that we've seen a high degree of proliferation in is the gig economy workforce. So how do you create almost a structural shift in terms of part-time, caregiving opportunities, which we saw through our Saraswati platform, or what we were doing in the elder care space. So it's almost like the proliferation of a gig workforce thanks to technology. And the third and the most interesting aspect, which is like completely diverse from anything Amy said, was we've realized that almost everyone's become a tech native, and whether it is the caregiver or the consumer, unlike the elderly who Amy was talking about, and it's fascinating for me because I saw this with my father and my father-in-law. They were learning all these new gadgets, but because people are tech natives, I think this gravitation towards the customer experience, which I'm sure Helen can speak really actively to, it's almost an imperative now that you create that experience as you move along.
No, you're absolutely right. I was smiling when you were saying tech natives. I remember my mom telling me at one point during the pandemic that she feels like a technology refugee, being kind of forced into a new area. And I think it helps us think about this question of technology and digital divide and access, and making sure we're recognizing different levels of technology literacy and otherwise as we roll out some of these interventions. Helen, anything to add on this point?
Yeah, I think Pew has done a really marvelous job just in terms of changing our paradigm of thinking about how people utilize technologies. And what I'll caveat in terms of digital divide is that I think people tend to see that in a very black and white sort of, very sort of in a very non-nuanced sort of way. And what we actually find is that whether you're talking about, older adults, or you're talking about certain different segments of the, total American population, people are utilizing technology. They're just utilizing them in different ways. Our approach at Care Academy, we always talk about accessibility, right? It's not the idea that you build something and people come, but how do you build towards a population? Assume that we're all just respectively utilizing different types of technologies. It's about how, if we're building for a population, how do we approximate the experiences that they're having? one of the things I love citing is the fact that we know that older adults and this cross segments with a lot of the folks who utilize a platform like Care Academy are the highest users and adopters of platforms like Facebook, right, over the last 15 years. So knowing that, you know, as a consumer, your users are gravitating towards a certain technology, how do you approximate even the experiences that they're getting from an experience like that one? So what I'll challenge, internally at Care Academy, we do this a lot, but you know, throughout, as we think about technology and adoption of technologies, how do we create opportunities for access by making sure we're as close as possible to the folks that we're touching, because there's a lot of nuance when we talk about sort of what the digital divide in access is, right? When we talk about sort of things like bandwidth access and being able to provide that is more infrastructural. And those are opportunities definitely for improvement across communities. But if we think about the user, and I think the last panel did a really great job on talking about this, how do we approximate the access points where communities, people are more likely to utilize the technology, and thinking from that perspective? It's a whole paradigm shift.
It's a great point, and like everything else, there's no one solution that's going to solve all our problems. And I think, as you mentioned, that each community, each family has different needs, and the technology providers, I think, are getting more attuned to those layers of needs, and I think we're seeing some really exciting innovations around the care space. So I have a question. This is one that we didn't prep for, but I'm interested in your perspectives, because during the pandemic, we saw people engaging in, and Amy, you talked about this before, you know, 24-hour care when they didn't necessarily do that before, or losing the support systems and networks that they had in place before, as you know, families became more isolated. And I'm just wondering what you're seeing in the gender divide of caregiving, and if any of this forced communal care models in some families changed the degree to which men and boys took on more caregiving, or are we going to come out of the pandemic as it has always been, with women shouldering the majority of the burden of care? I didn't know if anybody had any thoughts.
I'll just jump in. I think you have a really good point. And I think what I saw was more men jumping in, playing those roles, especially if they were two spouses working from home, children at home, and homeschooling and caregiving for a loved one, which is about 30% of family caregivers are in that sandwich situation. So then there was a lot more of trading off and sharing roles. And, you know, we see more men in our online caregiving group than we had in the past. So there was a jump in that. There's still far majority are women. And, you know, I don't have a crystal ball, but I would guess that going forward, there will be a little bit of a bump of more men. We've been seeing this as an increasing trend anyway, from our 2015 survey to our 2020 survey. There were more men playing caregiving roles. So it used to be about 50-50, now it's, you know, 60-40. So I think there is going to be a bit of an increase, but I think it will still be majority women.
Yeah, I would also say, like, as a mom of two boys, and you know, someone who has a household which is largely male dominated, the degree of support that I saw coming from both the boys and my husband was incredible. Because again, you know, in the context of the normalizing, I think there is a sense of empathy that got created. You did suddenly see more men talking about the fact that, hey, I need to drop off because, you know, I have the kids and my wife is, you know, going crazy. So there was a degree of empathy, and this whole notion of saying you know, we have to do our bit. So I agree with you, Amy. I think, you know, I'm hoping it's a sustained process. One, because there is a visual element to seeing what women are going through. Second is, you know, there's a willingness to contribute. And hopefully, you know, as the next generation who's seen all of us go through this for a couple of years, they've internalized this and, you know, do their bit in moving that 40% further from where it is.
Yeah, I'll chime in and say, you know, I think a lot of that has to do with socialization. I was thinking as I was reflecting on your question, Susan, I was like, it's about socialization. It's about seeing sort of where the shifts are. But in terms of the numbers, I think that there are things that I'm heartened by. One, in our line of work, we are seeing an increase in the number of caregivers who are identifying as men, right? Who are identifying as folks who never would have imagined themselves probably as caregivers before, but because of the pandemic and as a sort of a line or extension of work and healthcare work, it's so the norming is happening socially for men to enter the workforce as caregivers and also in allied healthcare in support roles. I also believe that because of the impacts of the bottom lines of a lot of companies who have seen that attrition and are finding it hard to, get workers because of sort of the bottom line of that's been drawn and exacerbated out of the pandemic, that caregiving work and what is, the GDP attributed to caregiving work and what that means from a healthcare perspective and an infrastructure perspective, that you are going to have sort of, a revision of what it means to care and the impacts of care, right? I think this is a wonderful sort of platform to be talking about all the impacts socially as well as economically of not being able to sort of fill the gaps and sort of change the paradigm of who does caregiving, and we're starting to see that change, at least professionally.
Yeah, it's a great point, Helen, and I think you raised a really interesting question about who's going to be doing this caregiving moving forward. And all three of you, I appreciate the optimism around more gender equity in caregiving, because I think that's critical. It's critical for our families, our societies, and this workforce that we need moving forward. And one of the drivers of that expanded need is of course the aging of our population. And as we have the baby boomers aging upwards, we can see demographically the need for more caregivers. And so Amy, starting with you, how are we addressing this expanding need for caregivers, both from a numbers standpoint and maybe some evolving capabilities that they're going to need to learn? Any insights there?
Well, we are seeing, as you see, there's a huge growth. 1 in 5 Americans are family caregivers. I think 1 in 6 employees are caregiving in some capacity. So we see this growth, and at ARP, what we're trying to do is understand what the needs are and then be there for them when they need it. And caregivers tend to reach out when they're in a crisis or when there's a certain need. They don't necessarily want to have education about financial management until they're in financial crisis, or they don't want to learn about difficult things like incontinence care unless they're in that situation. So we're trying to have those things available for them and make them easily accessible. I think that the need, especially with so many working caregivers, is for them to be able to access that information when it's convenient to them. So we see more caregivers accessing videos about how, mobility, how to help someone transfer from a bed to a wheelchair. Very specific things, nutrition, diet, very specific caregiving tasks are what they're really wanting. And I think that's why this Facebook group I mentioned has been so popular, because they can go in there when they're having a problem and say, oh no, how do I do this? Or how did you manage this? And they get 50 to 60 people saying, okay, here's what worked for me. And so it's a very responsive kind of approach with the family caregivers. Technology is playing a huge role in that. We found during the pandemic that we were reaching far more caregivers than when we just had in-person events and that type of thing. So I think caregiving is being hugely enhanced by the technology options in terms of training, finding support, and connecting with resources. We have a lot of people who use our online community resource finder tool to find those local resources for their loved ones, especially if they don't live in that community, they don't know the community. So I think overall, the possibilities are endless in terms of using technology to find caregivers and connect with them when they need it.
Yeah, it's great to hear. And especially since, going back to one of the topics we started with, which the Great Resignation, people leaving the workforce, and women specifically. One of the things that we hear frequently is that that one of the reasons women leave is there isn't enough available affordable childcare. And Priya, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the childcare capacity out there, and what needs to be done.
Yeah, so I think right now, childcare as an industry is fairly fragmented, and both providers and centers, these are high fixed cost environments. So you have real estate, you have staff costs, and through the pandemic, as children left, just given the fragmented nature of the industry, capacity went down, and care needs were felt at a disproportionate amount, and probably at an unprecedented level historically. So the question is, how do we systemically create capacity, and what do we do? What is the role of the parent, the employer, and the government in terms of creating what I call the soft infrastructure, right? This is the soft infrastructure that enables women both to stay in the workplace, but also continue to sustain themselves in the workplace. Most moms will settle for something equal to what they can provide at home, but what they're looking for is something better than what they can provide at home in a care environment. So how do you create that infrastructure, and whose responsibility is that, and how do we think about it systemically? The good thing is employers have come forward and are willing to support it. They see workplace childcare as definitely as much of an amenity as food, in an office environment, as transportation in an office environment. So even in the hybrid context, I think this is something that employers are considering, which is an encouraging notion. And all that the government's doing now, from the ARPA funding and the pre-K bills and the effort towards creating that capacity, all of that feels directionally right. And I feel, over time, through all these elements working together, we will find the right infrastructure. The question that I think, which, again, as a mom of teenagers, that I grappled with but didn't realize systemically, was that it wasn't just care that was getting women to quit. It was also educational fallbacks, right? So a lot of children went through setbacks because of online school. And once you realize that their child's falling back academically, what kind of supports would you provide? And so you have to think about what is the point in time need, and whether that's care, whether it's education, whether it's mental health and well-being for children. I think systemically we have to create that infrastructure. Otherwise, we run the risk of, women sort of taking that brunt and leaving the workforce.
Yeah, great points. And in our last couple of minutes, Helen, and then maybe we can go to Amy. What advice do you give women who are either finding themselves in a caregiving challenge, sandwiched between children and aging adults, or otherwise contemplating maybe joining the caregiving workforce? Any advice?
I think this is we're into both a critical needs moment, right? A turning point in terms of, to Priya's point earlier, how coming out of this pandemic, the importance of caregiving is valued, right? Whether that's quantified by dollars or the importance to the workforce. And it's also, I think we're going to enter into a golden era of caregiving, born out of competitiveness. And what that means right now as an employer, we've had several folks talk about and outline ways in which they're creating flexibility as a means of competitively attracting the workforce. And I think that women can, in 2019, maybe this wasn't as possible, but I certainly do believe in 2022, can stand from a place of power to not have to compartmentalize the part of themselves that is a caregiver, right? It impacts every aspect of life, including work. And so I think it's making sure from a place of advocacy, tying in the value of that individual and speaking that up in terms of looking for an employer and an expectation that employers are making room for women to show up as caregivers. So.
That's great. And Amy, I think we've run out of time, but we'll look forward to hearing from you soon. Let me take this moment to thank Amy, Helen, Priya for your wonderful commentary, and encourage all of our folks in the audience to send a special note of thank you and appreciation to all of our caregivers out there, and look forward to hearing the rest of the panelists during the day. Thank you all.
Susan.